Welcome, my name is Jo Frost. I'm here with my co-host Peter Lynas, and we are delighted to be bringing you a seminar for Spring Harvest Home called Being Human.
Yes, and we host a hit, or at least soon to be hit, podcast by that very name, Being Human, thus the title for the session. We both work for the Evangelical Alliance. Jo is head of comms, I'm the UK director. And we think fundamentally that being human is the key question, the most contested idea arguably in our culture, and that we also believe that this coronavirus that we're in the midst of, this global pandemic, has brought questions of health, around death, around our own mortality, and the finitude of humanness right to the forefront. And so it's critical to be discussing these.
Sure. I mean, we're hearing every day, aren't we? Just death tolls, people who are dying. We are hearing those national numbers. We're hearing those about countries that we have close relationships with, and we're hearing globally. We are utterly being faced with our mortality and what it means to be human. So these are big questions for us to be having. Those over 70, those with preconditioning conditions have been asked to self-isolate, because if they don't, they are going to get sick. They could easily die, and we have changed our entire culture to protect the most vulnerable and to keep our society functioning. So these are big stories for us to be discussing now.
Totally, and we live in a culture then where there are these kind of contested narratives or stories. We are story creatures, and there are many competing stories trying to tell us who we are, our identity, our understanding of personhood at this moment. And these cultural stories give us permission to seek success, to live in our family lives, to love, to be accepted. And these are stories that offer us individually sort of rights and dignities, and they're really a key part of who we are.
Yes, and coronavirus is calling those stories into question. Eugene Peterson, who we love, says that our Holy Scriptures, our Bible, is story-shaped. Our reality is story-shaped, the world is story-shaped, and our lives are story-shaped. So these stories are incredibly important and incredibly powerful.
And this should be the moment, in a sense, when the Christian story wins through. And in some cases it is, but there's also this challenge as to why is it not? If our story makes sense, the biblical story defines all things, why are we struggling to engage a secular culture? And part of the reason that we're arguing is that our story has become too small. We have shrunk the God story, and so it has little to say to our culture. The larger story begins in Genesis 1 and 2. Pre-fall, it was good, it was good, it was good, and it goes through to Revelation 21 and 22, where God will make his dwelling place with humanity. But too often we have shrunk down to a half-gospel story, very much about the individual. You're a sinner, you're fallen, Jesus died on a cross for you, the Easter story, but shrunk to a very individualized level. And that half gospel doesn't have traction, and it particularly doesn't have traction in a moment like this when people are looking for something bigger that is going to engage with the larger cultural issues around us.
Yes. So this narrow gospel that is all about putting right what went wrong, as opposed to starting with goodness and ending with hope, has very little to say to a culture that is totally panicked by the coronavirus, faced with its own mortality. This is a gospel, when it's so small, that is built on fear of what happens to me when I die. But this larger story that we find in the Bible, this biblical story, is so much more hopeful than that. The world, God made the world, and it is good. Sin entered the world and corrupted it. Brokenness, pain, hurt, isolation, loss, sickness, disease is a result of that fall. But God hasn't left us in that state. You, me, everyone watching at home, we all are so loved and so honoured by God that he did not deny us his son, but he gave his son so that we could be restored, so that we could be reconciled, so that we could be made new. And that is the promise of the new heaven and the new earth, where God makes his dwelling place with his people.
Yeah, and it's not just the renewal of you and me, it's the renewal of the whole cosmos. God so loved the whole cosmos. And that's what we love about this. So we're fascinated by this larger story, the new heavens, the new earth, the scale and the breadth of the redemptive act of Jesus in this moment. And so we're kind of setting out our stall there. We think to be human is to be made in the image of God, that we are to be human is to be a storied creature, to live into the fullness of creation, fall, redemption, recreation. And so we want to look in this session that we have together with people at four areas. The first of those is dignity. Everyone is a divine image bearer. Everybody has value. The second of those is around relationships. Strange that it is to be doing that over Zoom. That we are made in the image of a relational God. We are wired for relationships. The third of those is purpose. Each of us have a sense of purpose to steward and to cultivate parts of creation. And finally, to be human is to be free, and the challenge of that in this moment.
Okay, so getting started then. Dignity. To be human is to bear God's image. Everybody has value, no matter how old, young, no matter where they come from, what their wealth or success is. Everybody has dignity. And yet, the coronavirus crisis is forcing ethical dilemmas on medical staff, on who gets resources, what value we place on who and why. Massive questions. They're exposing the fragility of our cultural story at the moment.
Yeah, so the notion that we are all made in the image of God and everybody therefore is equal is a uniquely Christian claim upon this world. It's part of the God story that other stories don't have. And so the idea that we all have universal human rights, that when we go into hospital, everybody deserves to be treated equally, is a fundamentally Christian idea. And actually at this moment, it's going to be severely challenged, because if either of us were to have an underlying condition, we're going to be treated differently whenever we go into hospital. I met a nurse coming back and she said she'd just been retrained. And so we were doing the kind of over the garden fence chat, and she was just saying she found it really traumatic, because normally, let's say my mum and I go to hospital with the same condition. My mum is more like, we're going to be treated at least equally. If anything, she'll be treated quicker and more so because she's older and more vulnerable. And yet, ironically, in this moment, in all likelihood, I'd be the one being treated and she'd be being set to the side, which just seems like so challenging and tragic.
Yeah, it's really tricky to know what to do and how to make some of these decisions when dignity is such a fundamental part of what it means to be human. How do we, as a society, accept some of the decisions that are being made? And what do we do as Christians navigating this challenge, navigating this crisis? How do we respond in step with Jesus? So for me, what I find really fascinating about the story of the history of the church is that in times of crisis, in times of plague or illness, it was the Christians who were the last to leave. They were the ones that lent in. They were the ones that bestowed dignity on those that the rest of society had deemed worthless. And I think what we'll see over the next few months is that desire to help will get tiring. And for me, my prayer is that the church will be the last to leave. We will all be looking out to see who needs the dignity, who needs to be affirmed in their value and in their worth in the eyes of God. And how do we model who Jesus is and how Jesus showed compassion in this crisis to those who are easily forgotten or dismissed at this time.
One of the things we've been doing is contacting all of our member organizations and churches. And so we've been ringing lots of ministers. And one of the things that's been really difficult actually in chatting to them is just the demands in their time, firstly, but also for many of them as chaplains who are so used to going into hospital to visit those who are sick and those who are in isolation. They can't do that at this moment. And so there's a real question of dignity around those who are close to death, speaking to others who've run funerals and just somebody under 40 who died from COVID, and 6-7 people coming to a funeral, them standing at the graveside, they're 5 meters back, everybody's further behind them and isolated. There's no wake. I'm based here in Northern Ireland, where that kind of culture of going around to the house is so important. So the lack of dignity in this moment of death and the challenge for the church to kind of navigate some of that and override that, incredibly difficult. And one other story we've both been looking at and talking about was the kind of nationalist protection here. So the US is stopping shipments of medical equipment to other countries. The resources they produce. Suddenly, our American lives worth more than other lives. Our British lives worth more than other lives. Whose life values is valued most in this crisis? It's really forcing us to make some decisions, and it's revealing the kind of utilitarian usefulness kind of metric we have underneath. Who's most useful to our economy? We'll try and save those lives. So,
Yeah. But also what it does is it exposes a story that says we haven't got enough. As soon as you are saying that we're going to close the borders, we're going to limit who gets, we're going to put this on, you're operating under a story that says there is lack in this world. Whereas we worship a God of abundance. We worship a God who lavishes, who calls us to be generous. So when we see the world shutting down, closing borders, limiting, restricting, we need to turn around and look to our Jehovah Jireh and say, no, we are going to do the opposite. We're going to be generous. We're going to give out of what we have and not store it for ourselves. Because as everything's shutting down, that is the exact moment for the kingdom of God to come topsy-turvy into that space and say, no, there is more, not less, for us to offer.
Yes. So second area we want to look at is relationships. Because we are relational beings and we are wired for that. And even Enneagram 5s like me are missing hugging in this moment and physical contact, surreal as it is. Social distancing is such a challenge to our relationships in this moment, as everything seems to happen by Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or whatever other brand you want to slot in there.
Even this. So exactly, our relationships have shifted and changed, and yet relationships are so core to who we are. We're realizing what is so important in this moment, and it's who we connect with, and it's how we connect. I'll speak to my mum maybe once a week if I'm doing really well. In this coronavirus crisis, I'm phoning her every day, every dinner time. We're sharing dinner together because she's really important to me. We live in a society that has told us that the story is me. I am the most important person in my world. But actually, what we're realizing in this crisis is that it's just simply not true. The most important in this world is we. And how do we function? How do we flourish? How do we thrive when proximity has become so challenging? And that's a real challenge for us as a church and as a community to understand and to navigate.
Yeah, and that proximity is the challenge is doing this. So the therapists are telling us that Zoom is a challenge because of the plausible deniability of each other's absence, that our bodies experience this sense of dissonance because we can see each other, but we're not physically present, and bodies pick up so much from context that we just can't read. And then there's just a surreal little image of ourselves down in the bottom corner so we can see ourselves back as we do these kind of conference calls and Zooms, and we're just not used to this way of relating. And so we've, again, making those calls, we're experiencing this challenge. Single people, those in loneliness and isolation, pressures on marriages and family units because we're now not seeing anybody else in this moment. The limited contact with neighbours, but that's kind of very surreal. We've seen churches going online, lots of people experiencing that, but also acknowledging the limitations. The thought was maybe that loads of people would go to the big churches that can produce the best online experience, but actually people don't, because that's not what we're going for in this moment. We actually want the local with the Facebook feed down the side and interacting in comments. We don't want it to be highly polished. We just want the people that we're used to connecting with, our gathered communities.
Yeah.
And we want those moments again.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when the relationships are broken, when we see the sinfulness creep in, where staying at home and staying safe isn't the same thing. How do we take care and lean in and show compassion again for those relationships of the stranger, of the other, of the person that we wouldn't normally connect with or we might never meet? What does it mean to be non-anxious presence in the supermarkets or down the street? What does it mean to talk to our neighbours over the fence and say, we are in this together, you are not alone? There are really amazing challenges for us as Christians to operate in this world and to bestow relationship and a true story rather than the frail, fragmented one that we are often operating under.
Yeah. And we're going to have to be much more intentional. I think we've said that they aren't going to happen by accident. We're not going to bump into people in the same way. So it's going to take time. And that's why we feel exhausted. It takes a lot more time to do bilateral one-on-ones because we don't get the kind of gathered communities in the same way. But they're critically important and they're being stripped away. And in an individualistic society, we're realizing we're not individuals. We do need relationships. So I'm the timekeeper, apparently, so we have to keep going. We're on to purpose. We've done dignity. We've done relationships. We are on to number 3 on our list. with this sense of purpose in this moment of furloughing, of working from home, of underemployment, re-employment, unemployment for some. It's a real challenge to our whole sense of identity and purpose in the huge economic implications of the coronavirus and this global pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, purpose is such a key part of who we are, isn't it? I mean, as soon as you meet somebody for the first time, you ask them their name, and then what's the next question? What do you do? We define ourselves by our activity or lack thereof. And so when you're furloughed, what does that say about your status and about your value and about your worth? What does that say if you are underemployed at the moment and just sat at home feeling bored and can't even face watching the next box set on Netflix? Or even what happens if you're still overemployed, you're busier than you've ever been before, but all of your normal practices, all the ways that you understood how to work, felt competent, felt capable, all of those things have changed. They cause deep-rooted questions about who we are, where our value comes, what our worth is, because our purpose is so important, and yet often for us, we've made it a bit of an idol.
And we've had some redefinition of what it is to be an essential worker. Healthcare workers, social care workers, those on the front line. Delivery drivers are our new essential workers. And so there's something wonderful about that and the redefining of really who's the most important in our economy at this moment. And the church has had some real pressure as to what it means then. So gathered, those who really focus on the gathered, that's not possible now. And important as that is, we've got to relook at scattered models where all of us are the priesthood of all believers, where the church is unleashed to take spring harvest's time. We're sent out into the world. Well, at this moment, that is the only way in which we can function. There's so little we can do in any kind of gathered form. So it's redefining the purpose of us individually, or we're having to certainly look at that, but also as organizations and as churches and as a whole culture, we're saying actually what's really important to us in this moment. And I think that's a really healthy thing as we rethink families, work roles, our whole sense of identity, what it is to be in Christ at this moment when there's so many limitations in what we could traditionally do.
Absolutely. I think in one respect there are going to be some really good beneficial things that come out of this crisis, and for me one of those has to be this idea of Sabbath. We talk about it loads in our podcast. We're really keen on this idea of rest, of accepting that the world doesn't revolve around me, and if I stop, it's not all going to collapse. We have been forced into a prolonged state of Sabbath, and many of us are rebelling against that. We're trying to stay busy, we're trying to stay purposeful, and yet God has always called us into a weekly rhythm, a annual rhythm, and a generational rhythm that says stop, rest, come back to what is important, come back to me. So in this time of enforced Sabbath, what does that look like for your relationship with Jesus? What does that look like for your relationship with family and friends? How do we worship and invest our time in this space when everything else has been closed down?
Great. And the final thing we're looking at is freedom. We spent the entire first series of our podcast very much exploring ideas around freedom, around choice and control, and around our freedoms being, sacrifice. We talked about that and the need for that. And actually now that's kind of enforced upon us, that we have to stay home to look after and save lives of other people, that we live in arguably the freest society that's ever been. But in this moment, we've seen a massive curtailing of that in lockdown, as it's called, or lock-in, as we Irish call it, and it makes it sound more fun. That's the positive spin in the moment that we're in. But this has been a massive shift from a highly individualistic free culture to a very collective and arguably not at all free culture, with big arguments about whether it's okay to go to the park or not at this moment.
Yeah. And what an amazing thing this crisis has done to help us understand just how different the definitions of what it means to be free are. Our culture says freedom is choice and control. I get to choose what I want to do. I'm in control of my own life. That has been debunked as the biggest myth out there. You're not in control. You don't have the choices. You need to take care of each other. And yet The gospel story, the biblical story, has always been that freedom is found in relationship with God, that it is when we live our life through the source of life that we find ourselves to be free. That means that submission and sacrifice can be part of our freedom. We are free because we submit our liberty to save the lives of others. And that's a very different story to the one that our culture normally tells and is failing us at this time.
And certainly for me, one of the things in this kind of lockdown mode is the freedoms we take for granted. So realizing and probably having a much greater appreciation for brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who don't have those kind of freedoms. So it's only when your freedoms are taken from you, you begin to realize how free you previously were.
Yeah.
Then we're also really alert to what the legislation says. Former lawyer that I am, certainly really intrigued about that. I mean, this is for 2 years it's been passed. There's possibility of that being extended. These are extremely draconian powers, necessary in the instant, but we also want to be really alert. These allow you to lock people up on suspicion of having the virus, take children away. There's very extreme powers at the far end of this that we want to be super alert to. And you see that with someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's really passed just total power to be a dictator without any kind of elections or any kind of comeback. So we want to be really alert to that. There have been people like Jonathan Sumption, a former Supreme Court judge, just been saying, be careful where these powers lead to. These are moments when totalitarian ideas come to the fore. You'll see the nationalistic and protectionist tendencies coming up. You'll see legislation being pushed through. We had that somewhat ironically in Northern Ireland, abortion legislation, my body, my choice, the very individualist sentiment at the very moment when the health service needs all the help that it can. And so we need to be careful as to what's pushed through at these moments. But overall, we're being pushed to say, well, what freedoms do we still have? Huge amounts of freedoms to share the gospel. We just need to get creative as to how to do that online. We have freedom to do as we like still within our own homes, to pray together, to meet together, to form those habits. And so we want to use the freedoms that we have more wisely, because now we've been pushed to understand how important they are to us.
Yeah. I mean, freedom is just such a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And in this moment, those questions, those stories are coming out in such full force. The phrase that is ringing in my head at the moment is a quote, I don't know where it comes from, but there's no such thing in society as the voiceless. There is simply the silenced and the willfully ignored. When our freedoms are being challenged in good ways and in ways that need scrutiny and need checking, look for those who are being ignored, look for those who are being silenced, because those are the freedoms that we will advocate for and on behalf of, with the voice of justice at every opportunity. And that's what we do, isn't it? That's why we as Christians are there operating, being a priest, being a prophet, saying the kingdom is here to all, and not allowing the injustice to flourish in a society where everything is shifted and changed.
Yes. So as we try and bring this into land, we're recording this a few days before when Boris Johnson's just been taken into hospital. He's been unwell. It's interesting to watch the comments from some other world leaders, thinking of you and wishing you well. And I always think that shows the kind of the shallowness in a way of the secular story. There's not a lot else you can say in this moment. He's a random collection of cells on that story. Those cells are not well right now, and so they can wish and they can think, but they can't pray and they can't hope. There's nothing more to that shallow secular story. And we as Christians want to live into this fuller, richer gospel story that has a full account of what it is to be human, and that doesn't ignore the reality of this pandemic that we're in, but wants to talk about a good world that was created by God, and also look towards not only a personal salvation and redemption, but something so much bigger, the recreation and renewal of all things in the new heaven and the new earth. So we're coming into close. We both love Andy Crouch. He's talked about culture. He's written a great piece, I think, for the moment that we're in. He says there's three phases. One is the blizzard, 2 is the winter, 3 is the mini ice age. So he says, we're right now in the blizzard. A blizzard has come. And wow, is it kind of overwhelming. Secondly, then, the winter is coming. There's going to be a longer response to that. This is the beginning of a more difficult period as we readjust all of what this means. And then there may well be a mini ice age after that, where some things radically change. Because some things will go back to the way they were, but many things will not. And so we need to reimagine what that looks like. So I think that's a really helpful kind of cultural lens to think through. And it's a final thought from each of us then as we try and wrap up in what it is to be human in a pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've both found the anti-crouch thing really helpful. And for me, the winter is the time of desolation. It is the time of loss, of death, of decay, that for many, many of us, this will be a time of lament, of grief, of sorrow, of remembering that God is the God who sits with us in the ashes, who comforts the brokenhearted, who sits with those who mourn. And many, many of us will be going through really difficult and challenging times throughout this crisis and the long tail thereafter. And that's okay. We are here to support each other, to comfort those who are hurting and give space for that hurt. But equally, the winter is also the time for new life. It is where the germination starts. It is the things that happen in the secret and in the dark and in the underground. And actually, we need to be looking to see what is the new life that God is birthing in this moment. What is the good that is happening in this space? And give that a chance to grow so that we don't just go back to business as usual and how things were. Because some things were out of whack. Some things were out of kilter. And there needs to be that space for God to redeem and to put right that which was broken. So I think for me, it's the lament, but also the hope. We cannot lose sight of the fact that there is always hope. If it's not good yet, it's not finished yet. There will always be hope as part of our story.
Great. 3 overlapping points for me there. The lament, as you said, that's not despair. That is not giving up, but it is a space to cry out. We're going to lose loved ones. This is going to be a difficult period. We cannot deny that. Second is the sense of being a non-anxious presence in a world riven by fear and deep uncertainty. There's a kind of calm, non-anxious presence piece. And the third is the hope that you've said, especially in around Easter. Hope is found in Jesus. Easter is that moment when hope in person surprised the whole world by coming forward from the future into the present. A lovely Tom Wright quote. But those are not linear ideas. It's not lament, then non-anxious presence, then hope. They're going to be cyclical ideas. We're going to go through seasons where we lament more and it's very personal to us. It's going to be seasons when we will be the non-anxious presence for those around us. And there are seasons where we absolutely have to be a signpost of hope for what is to come. So we hope that has been useful. It's been a very quick summary of some ideas we've had of what it is to be human in this pandemic, in this moment. As I say, we are both from the Evangelical Alliance. We love and want to serve and support the church here in the UK. We're a membership organisation. Please go along to eauk.org where you can find out more. You can join us. You can sign up and become a member. You can also find loads of resources about moving through this moment. We have a whole coronavirus kind of centre on our website. And also, Joe and I do host a podcast, the Being Human podcast. You can get it anywhere where you can get your podcasts. Being Human, look it up. You'll find us. First series was on freedom, and we will undoubtedly do some specials on the space and place in which we find ourselves. Be blessed.
Take care now. Bye-bye.